They were dragged into the streets not as criminals of theft or treason, but for something far more terrifying in the eyes of the empire. In the shadow of Constantinople's towering walls, whispers could seal a man's fate. A single accusation, a single rumor of forbidden desire, was enough to turn neighbors into executioners and friends into betrayers. By the decree of Emperor Justinian, the Byzantine Empire declared war not only on enemies beyond its borders, but on men within, men whose only crime was to love differently. And the punishments awaiting them were not just cruel. They were crafted to erase identity, to break spirit, and to burn a lesson into the memory of all who watched. At dawn, condemned men were paraded through the city, stripped of dignity, mocked, beaten, and branded. In the public squares, the punishments grew darker. Some were mutilated, their very bodies turned into a warning. Others were set ablaze, their screams rising with the smoke over the domes of Constantinople. And as the flames devoured them, the crowd cheered, not from hatred alone, but from fear. Because to show sympathy was to risk sharing their fate. This was not justice. This was theater. A performance of cruelty meant to terrify every witness. In Justinian's empire, homosexuality was not seen as a private matter. It was proclaimed a plague, a sin capable of inviting divine wrath upon the empire itself. And so, each punishment was not only about the condemned, it was about control. A way for the emperor and the church to tighten their grip on the souls of millions. But here's the darkest truth. These punishments did not end with death. They lived on in law, in scripture, in fear. They echoed through centuries, shaping the treatment of countless others long after Justinian was gone. So the question is not just what was done to them, but why. And as we peel back the layers of history, you'll see that the empire's cruelty was never just about morality. It was about power, control, and the crushing weight of fear. And once you know what they endured, you will never look at the Byzantine Empire the same way again. The Byzantine Empire of the 6th century was a world of extremes. On one side stood unimaginable wealth, golden domes glittering above Constantinople, mosaics shimmering with heavenly light, and markets overflowing with silks, spices, and treasures from across the known world. On the other side lurked shadows darker than any dungeon, poverty, disease, superstition, and a ruling class determined to control not only the bodies of its subjects, but their very souls. At the heart of this empire was Emperor Justinian I, remembered as both a lawgiver and a tyrant. His ambition was endless: to rebuild the glory of Rome, to expand the empire's reach, and to stamp his authority on every corner of society. He rebuilt Hagia Sophia into a towering marvel of Christian faith, codified laws in the Corpus Juris Civilis, and waged wars that drained the treasury but expanded the empire's legend. Yet Justinian's true weapon was not armies or architecture, it was fear. He understood that power endured not only by conquering enemies abroad, but by controlling thought and behavior at home. To defy him was to defy God, for he ruled not as a man, but as God's chosen. This was the stage upon which one of history's darkest persecutions unfolded. For centuries, whispers of same-sex desire had existed in the empire's shadows. In ancient Greece and Rome, relationships between men had been tolerated, even idealized in certain forms. But under Justinian's rule, tolerance became impossible. A new moral order was being forged, one rooted in the unbreakable alliance between throne and church. Justinian believed that sin was not a private matter. It was a disease, a contagion that, if left unchecked, would invite divine punishment upon the entire empire. Earthquakes, plagues, and invasions were seen not as natural misfortunes, but as God's wrath for the hidden sins of his people. And among those sins, none were considered more dangerous, more abominable than the love between men. So laws were rewritten with fire and blood. Homosexuality was declared a crime against nature, punishable by mutilation, exile, or death. The Corpus Juris Civilis made no attempt to soften its language. It condemned with the harsh certainty of divine judgment. And to enforce these laws, Justinian unleashed the full weight of imperial authority. For the accused, there was no safety. A glance too long, a friendship too close, a rumor whispered by a jealous neighbor. Any of these could end a life. The empire thrived on informants. To accuse another was to shield oneself, and fear turned friends into betrayers. Those accused were dragged before judges not as citizens seeking justice, but as sinners awaiting destruction. Trials were rarely fair. Evidence was often irrelevant. The accusation itself carried the weight of guilt. And once condemned, there was no mercy. The punishments were designed not only to eliminate the individual, but to terrify every onlooker. Public executions became a stage where morality and cruelty performed hand in hand. The condemned were stripped of dignity, paraded through streets, beaten by crowds, whipped into frenzy by priests who declared their deaths necessary for the empire's salvation. The spectacle was meant to send a message. This is what happens when desire dares to defy authority. And the empire watched. Some in silence, others in cheers, but all in fear. For to show sympathy was to invite suspicion, and suspicion was often as fatal as guilt. The silence of the crowds was not agreement. It was survival. Behind the golden mosaics and the chanting choirs, the Byzantine world was a place where shadows stretched long. And in those shadows, men who loved differently lived with the constant knowledge that discovery meant ruin. They hid their desires behind masks of piety, married women to escape suspicion, and whispered only in the darkest corners of taverns or secluded gardens. Even then, trust was fragile. One careless word, one misplaced glance, and the empire's machinery of punishment would descend. The cruelty was not just physical, it was psychological. Men were taught to fear themselves, to despise their own desires as demons sent to corrupt their souls. Confession was demanded not as healing, but as submission. To resist was to rebel against God himself. By the time Justinian's laws took root, a culture of terror had been cemented. Same-sex love, once woven quietly into the fabric of life, was now an unforgivable crime. And for those accused, the punishments waiting were not only barbaric, they were designed to haunt history. Because in Justinian's empire, the death of a man was never just a death. It was a lesson carved into flesh and bone, performed for an audience, and remembered as a warning. And as you will see, when the empire decided to make an example of gay men, it did so with a brutality that still chills the blood centuries later. By the time Justinian's decrees were carved into law, fear had already seeped into the cracks of Byzantine life. The empire was a place where the private and the public could never truly be separated. A man's home was never fully his own. His actions could be watched by servants, neighbors, or even family, eager to curry favor with the authorities. A whisper in the right ear could mean survival for one and death for another. It began quietly. At first, accusations were rare, almost symbolic. The empire wanted to send a message, not yet unleash a purge. But the message was clear enough. Men suspected of unnatural acts were hauled before the courts, their cases read out, not as trials of evidence, but as declarations of sin. Some were sentenced to mutilation, their bodies marked so they would forever carry the stigma of their crime. Others were paraded through the city before being cast into exile, stripped of wealth, titles, and dignity. The punishments grew harsher as Justinian's reign progressed. By the mid-6th century, the empire faced waves of disasters. Famine, earthquakes, and most devastating of all, the plague that would later bear Justinian's own name. To many, these calamities were not accidents of nature but signs of divine wrath. Priests thundered from the pulpits that God punished Byzantium because of hidden sins within its walls. And among these sins, same-sex desire was singled out as especially dangerous, a contagion that, if left unchecked, might bring about the empire's ruin. The emperor listened. In fact, he encouraged it. Justinian's laws declared explicitly that homosexual acts could call down God's anger upon the entire empire, endangering not just the guilty, but every citizen. In this worldview, punishing a few was not cruelty, it was survival. And so the machinery of punishment was expanded. Surveillance became a way of life. Informants were rewarded, suspicion celebrated. In taverns, men lowered their voices and glanced over their shoulders before speaking freely. Friendships between men, once normal and innocent, became dangerous. Too much closeness could invite suspicion. Even gestures of kindness were sometimes twisted into accusations. The empire's punishments were not hidden behind prison walls. They were spectacles. Public squares became theaters of cruelty where bodies, not words, delivered the message. To see a man whipped in chains for sins against nature was to learn that even a whisper of defiance could end in humiliation. To watch others burned alive was to understand that desire itself had become a death sentence. The fear was not confined to those accused. It spread into every household. Families lived in dread that one of their sons might be accused, that their lineage might be tainted by scandal. Fathers forced their sons into early marriages, hoping that a wife and children would shield them from suspicion. Mothers warned their children not to linger too long in the company of other men, not to speak carelessly, not to trust even their closest friends. But repression breeds shadows, and desire cannot be erased by decree. Men who loved differently still found each other, still sought connection in the hidden corners of the empire. Yet each encounter carried the risk of ruin. A single night of trust could become a death sentence if betrayed. And betrayal was common, for the rewards of accusation were tempting. Land, money, or safety could be bought with a single denunciation. The punishments grew more creative and more horrifying. Justinian's laws sanctioned burning alive for those who persisted in their sins. This was not merely execution. It was symbolic purification, fire consuming the body to cleanse the soul. The condemned were marched to the pyres while priests preached sermons over their screams, declaring that their suffering was proof of divine justice. In the chronicles that survive, the details are often sparse. The empire did not record names or preserve the humanity of the condemned, but fragments remain, enough to glimpse the horror. Entire groups of men, accused together, were burned in public as a warning. The fire consumed not just their bodies, but any chance of remembrance. Their voices were erased, leaving only the echoes of their punishment. As the years passed, the line between rumor and guilt vanished. To be accused was to be guilty, and to be guilty was to suffer in ways designed to linger in memory. The empire had perfected the art of making examples. A man could be mutilated in one city, so that the story of his fate would travel across provinces, ensuring that others would live in silence and fear. But silence is not the same as consent. Beneath the glittering mosaics of Hagia Sophia, beneath the processions of priests and the sermons of salvation, there were countless men who lived their entire lives in terror, not because they had harmed anyone, but because their very existence had been declared a crime. Their stories were never written, their names never preserved. Only the shadow of their suffering remains. And this was the rising storm of Justinian's empire, a world where the boundaries of love became boundaries of life and death, where desire itself was hunted, and where the punishments grew ever more barbaric in the name of divine justice. The stage was set for the darkest chapter of all. Because when Justinian sought to prove his empire's purity, he did not stop at humiliation or exile. He turned to fire, to blood, and to the public theater of horror. And it was in these moments, the executions that scarred the empire's memory, that the true brutality of his reign was revealed. The day of judgment was not announced with trumpets, but with whispers that spread faster than fire. In Constantinople, crowds gathered as if for a festival, yet the mood was anything but joyous. They came not to celebrate, but to watch men die. In the center of the square stood wooden stakes, piled high with bundles of dry brush and oil-soaked rags. The smell of tar hung heavy in the air, mingling with incense carried by priests who marched at the front of the procession. Behind them shuffled the condemned, men whose only crime had been to love differently. They were stripped of their tunics, their bodies beaten, their faces swollen from interrogation. Chains clinked with every step. Some stumbled, pushed forward by soldiers in bronze helmets. Others stared blankly ahead, their souls already broken. But all of them knew what awaited: the fire. The punishment was not designed for swiftness. It was theater, cruelty displayed for all to see. The condemned were bound tightly to the stakes, their arms stretched, their feet lashed so escape was impossible. Oil was poured over their heads, soaking their hair, running into their eyes. The crowd recoiled at the smell, yet no one dared speak out. To show pity was to risk being named next. As the priests lifted their voices, the sermons echoed across the square. They declared that these men had brought God's wrath upon the empire, that earthquakes, famines, and plagues were born of their sins. The message was clear. Their deaths were not executions, but sacrifices meant to cleanse the empire. Then came the torch. One by one, the bundles of brush ignited, flames licking upward until they caught the stakes themselves. The condemned screamed as the fire devoured them, their voices piercing the night like knives. Some cried for mercy, Others prayed. A few fell silent quickly, their lungs consumed by smoke. But the sound of human flesh burning filled the square, a sound no witness could ever forget. And still the crowd watched. Some crossed themselves in piety. Others turned their faces away, yet remained rooted in place. To leave was to risk suspicion, so they stayed, forced participants in the ritual of fear. The fire consumed not only the men, but their futures, their families, their names. No record would preserve them, no monument would mark their graves. Their existence was erased, reduced to ash carried by the wind across Constantinople. Yet the empire remembered, not with compassion but with terror. Parents warned their children of what they had seen. Neighbors whispered that God's justice had been done, and men who might once have dared to live openly shrank deeper into shadows, their lives ruled by silence. This was Justinian's empire at its most merciless. The punishments were not accidents of cruelty, but deliberate tools of control. Each execution was a reminder that the emperor's authority stretched not only over life and death, but over the most private corners of human desire. And as the last screams faded into smoke, one truth lingered above all. In Justinian's Byzantium, to love differently was not simply forbidden. It was a death sentence carried out with fire, humiliation, and the cheers of a fearful crowd. When the fires died down and the charred remains of the condemned were reduced to smoldering ash, the empire did not return to normal. The punishments had achieved their purpose, not simply in killing men, but in instilling a fear so deep that it reshaped the fabric of Byzantine society. For days afterward, the streets of Constantinople buzzed with whispers. People spoke of the screams, the smell of burning flesh, the way the flames lit the night like a second sun. Parents used the executions as warnings to their sons. Walk carefully. Do not invite suspicion. Even your thoughts may condemn you. The fear was generational, a shadow that would stretch long after Justinian's reign. But the deeper impact lay in the law itself. By making the private lives of men into matters of state, Justinian's edicts did more than criminalize. They weaponized intimacy. Love was no longer personal, it was political, and it could become lethal. This reshaped trust within families, friendships, and communities. A careless word, a jealous rival, or a wrong glance could be twisted into an accusation. And accusations alone were often enough. The empire's clergy reinforced this terror. Preachers declared that such executions had saved the city from God's wrath. They pointed to recent earthquakes, plagues, or famines as divine punishments caused by sins of the flesh. Every tragedy became fuel for the cycle. Suffering was proof of sin, and more blood was demanded to restore order. For those accused, there was no hope of defense. Trials were often little more than ceremonies, rituals of humiliation. The condemned were not treated as individuals but as warnings, stripped of humanity so their deaths could serve as lessons. They were burned not only to end their lives but to erase their memory, ensuring no martyrdom, no sympathy, and no rebellion. And yet, despite the brutality, resistance lingered. Quiet acts of defiance, hidden gatherings, secret relationships, coded language survived in the shadows of the empire. Human desire, after all, cannot be erased by decree. The punishments forced such lives underground, but they also gave rise to communities bound by secrecy, resilience, and silent solidarity. In a twisted way, Justinian's cruelty had the opposite effect of what he intended. It did not destroy love, but it made it more defiant. The long-term impact of Justinian's policies reached far beyond his empire. His legal codes, preserved and transmitted across centuries, influenced medieval Europe and shaped how later rulers viewed sexuality. For centuries afterward, laws in Christian kingdoms echoed the same punishments, the same rhetoric of sin, and the same calls for fire and death. The flames that consumed men in Constantinople would, centuries later, ignite again in the squares of Paris, London, and Rome. Historians today recognize this as one of the darkest legacies of Justinian's reign. He is often remembered as a lawgiver, a builder of Hagia Sophia, and a restorer of Roman lands. But hidden beneath those grand achievements lies a far more sinister truth. He institutionalized fear. He transformed personal intimacy into a weapon of control, a model later empires and churches would replicate with chilling precision. And yet, there is also something else to be remembered. Not the cruelty of the state, but the courage of its victims. Though their names have been lost to time, their suffering stands as testimony. They lived in a world that branded them as sinners, condemned them to fire, and demanded their silence. Yet their very existence, however erased, however hidden, was an act of resistance. Today, when historians, writers, or ordinary people reflect on this past, it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Prejudice disguised as morality has been used for centuries to justify unspeakable cruelty. Justinian's laws remind us how easily fear can be codified into law, how religion can be twisted into justification, and how society can be turned into a silent accomplice. The impact, then, is not only historical but deeply present. To remember these men is to recognize the cost of forgetting. It is to understand that the fight against prejudice is not new. It is as old as empire itself. And it is to honor those who were silenced by refusing to let their stories vanish into ash. The flames of Justinian's punishments burned bodies, but their smoke carries forward a warning across the centuries. Whenever fear and hate are written into law, human dignity itself is put to the stake.